Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for that warm welcome there with the song Girl from Ipanema. I'm sure that everybody recognizes that song. And its song was written in actually 1962 and was inspired by a couple of songwriters that observed this girl going down to the beach every day and just glided down the sidewalk in almost poetic fashion. And she had the gall to not even notice these guys. So I think that's a story of many guys in their lifetime. But that's a famous song, and that's a song that Brazil is known for. Brazil's known for a lot of things, for soccer and samba and carnival and the Amazon forest and Embraer. But there is so much more going on in a place like Brazil, as there is in all of Latin America. And so what we wanted to do was to take a few minutes here and hopefully give you some perspective on this market and give you some facts. And we have a great panel up here that we've assembled, and I'll go ahead and introduce those now. On my right here, Felipe Veneziano is with Cal Law, and they have an affiliation with HFW in London. And so we're very pleased to have Felipe. He's here for the first time from São Paulo, Brazil. So welcome, Felipe. Fabrice Roger, he's the sales director for Latin America for Jetcraft, and recently moved up here from Mexico City, lives in Miami now. I guess the nightlife wasn't exciting enough for you in Mexico City, was it, Fabrice? Fabrice also had a birthday yesterday, so I want to wish him happy birthday.
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone.
And on my far right here is Eduardo Ferreira. Eduardo is also Brazilian. He has been with FirstSource for 12 years now and is the lending manager for South America and has done a fantastic job. I think FirstSource is one of the largest lenders in South America and Latin America, and he'll give us some of his thoughts as well. So let's see here. Here we go. So let's start off with just some real basic facts about the Latin American market for business aviation. And you might not be aware of this, but of course, the U.S. is the largest market in terms of numbers of aircraft. But it may surprise you that the number 2 and number 3 markets for business aircraft, particularly business jets, is right here in our backyard. It's Brazil and Mexico. Brazil actually had more business jets than Mexico up until a few years ago. With the economic crisis, it lost maybe 150 aircraft that got exported. And so now Mexico leads with about 870 jets. Brazil has about 760 jets. But if you take those two countries and you combine their business aircraft or business jets, you're looking at 1,600 aircraft, and that's more than Canada, Germany, France, UK, and Australia combined. I mean, these are big markets, and they're right here. Part of that is just because of the size of the countries. Brazil is larger in terms of landmass than the lower 48 states. It's a huge country. I mean, you can fly from point to point, and it'd take you 5-6 hours to get from one side of the country to the other. It's a big place. Mexico is also obviously a powerhouse in terms of business jets, and we're going to unpack that a little bit more here. Brazil has almost 22,000 registered general aviation aircraft. 126 airports have commercial air service versus 550 airports in the U.S. There's no interstate highway system. Railroad system, again, and waterways are not even compared to what we have here in the U.S. So there really are transportation challenges. So as Brazilians and Mexicans try to get around their countries and now are doing more and more business internationally, they need private aircraft. They need business aircraft. So that explains why there's such high numbers here. Just a couple of points on GDP that just, of course, like anywhere else, the private aviation sector follows the economy, and that has been true in Brazil. Brazil in 2016, the GDP actually suffered a shrinking of 3.5%, but it bounced back to 1% in 2017, so that's a 4.5-point swing. And then in 2018 now, we're estimating 2.7% growth in this year alone. So that's a remarkable turnaround for that economy. And I guess if you were to characterize the Brazilian aviation market in the last few years, even with this scenario, it would be with one word, and that's resiliency. The number of aircraft, even though they lost business jets, they picked up a lot of other aircraft, particularly with the general aviation sector. They actually gained in numbers by 1%. So that's the situation in Brazil. Mexico GDP was 2.9% in 2016. It fell back to 2% in 2017, and then just real stable here in 2018. So not a lot of wild swings there. Just looking at the Brazil real dollar, just to give you a perspective on what's happened with the currency. Brian Proctor brought that up yesterday. That's a real important factor for international markets, is how much aircraft are going to cost in their local currency. If you look at a year ago, the real was 3.2 to $1 dollar, and by the time we got to September of this year, it had gotten up to 4.2. That's a pretty big devaluation. And so that explains the slowdown. But then with the presidential election that just occurred, that Felipe will talk about here in a minute, that has dropped back now to 3.75 or something like that. So it's actually strengthened 11% versus the dollar. The Mexican peso has weakened about 5 to 9% in the last 90 days. And so you just see there with the graph over the last year, it's just been up and down, but pretty stable in that 18, 19, 20 pesos per dollar range. So what I'd like to do is to have Felipe go through just a short presentation, just give us an update, some historical perspective, and then also talk about some of the tax and regulatory aspects to the Brazilian aviation market. So Felipe, please inform us.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, David. Doing business down south, can be quite complex and difficult for investors, financiers, and lessors, particularly considering that countries in Latin America, they are not common law jurisdiction as the US, but rather civil law. So there would be a lot of uncertainty, and that's one of the reasons that motivated, and of course this is a very brief summary, motivated the creation and implementation of this international treaty, which is one of the most successful treaties in commercial law, that is the Cape Town Convention and the Aircraft Protocol, that allows enhanced protection for creditors and financiers in movable asset transactions, including aircraft engines, and helicopters. And if you take a look where the largest fleets are located in Latin America, as Fabrice also mentioned, you have Brazil, Argentina, already implemented Cape Town. Argentina just implemented August of this year. We are still expecting Chile to implement it. It was just signed, as well as in Jamaica and French Guiana, which is part of France, of course. But having Cape Town and the Aircraft Protocol effective in those jurisdictions, it gives more certainty. It can provide cheaper financing. It mitigates the risks of an investor when they are looking either for an acquisition of an aircraft, sale of an aircraft, or to provide a credit facility to a company incorporated in one of those countries. We do not expect Cape Town to be implemented in other jurisdictions in Latin America, except for these as shown in the map, in the very near future. There's a lot of discussions about Chile bringing it to force, but there's some resistance from local airlines, to be honest. But what we saw is once Cape Town was implemented in Brazil, LATAM Airlines was able to secure a $1.3 billion US WTC, the first of its kind in Latin America. There are talks about a WTC for Aviation in Colombia, depending on how they will do economy-wise, and also in Panama with Copa. And only Brazil and Panama qualify for the OECD discount, which is it's a recognition, a certification by OECD that Cape Town has been implemented in a way that would allow the necessary protection for the lessors and financiers in relation to aircraft equipment in those jurisdictions. So although Argentina just implemented it, is a long process until the OECD discount is given to that particular country. It's worth mentioning that Paraguay, although it's a very small economy, it has a small fleet, but some aircraft operates there, registered in the US, not registered in Paraguay, since Paraguay allows operation of international registered aircraft on its territory, which is not the case for Brazil, for instance. Paraguay is really tackling a commercial law reform to enhance a investor and creditor position. And it also has an intention to ratify and sign Cape Town Convention, but first the talks and the government wishes to implement a reform on its commercial law to provide also a more modern registration system and some protections that should reflect the bankruptcy code of the United States from Section 1110. Just now, focusing on Brazil, the country where I practice, we do have very good precedents in relation to the use of the IDERA, which is request authorization. It's a document that can be used by a lessor, by a creditor, financier, to both deregister the aircraft from the aeronautical registry and export it out of the country. We always have the questions from clients and investors, whoever is looking to Brazil, how is Cape Town implemented? How has Cape Town been working in Brazil? Unfortunately, we do not have any court precedents yet, because the largest bankruptcy of airlines took place in Brazil 2005, 2006. But we do have some precedents on an administrative level of the use of IDERAs. The IDERAs are accepted by the Aviation Authority. They are duly recorded as a standard practice. And we worked on one particular transaction, which is considered a leading case for the use of IDERA in Brazil, where an aircraft was impounded by tax authorities. It was under a tax investigation for evasion. And the bank was asking for the registration to be canceled so we could take the aircraft out of Brazil and resell it. Tax authorities told Aviation Authority, do not deregister because it's subject to an investigation. We went to Aviation Authority and said, pursuant to Cape Town, there's nothing in the world that should not allow a holder of an IDERA to export and cancel the registration of the aircraft. And Aviation Authority really understood the concept and canceled the registration marks within 1 day of the request. So that's a very positive precedent. Investors are positively impressed about this. Now, we do not have any, however, nothing is perfect, so we do not have any regulations passed by tax authorities for the export process. But it's a burden for the lessee or for the operator in Brazil. A financier can take the aircraft out, and then it will be for the lessee or former operator of the aircraft to liaise and deal with tax authorities for those issues. It's also worth noting that we do have a bill of law that is trying to reform and adapt our aeronautical code, which dates back to 1986. So it's fairly old. It does not contemplate a lot of new technologies, does not contemplate drones. It has a very strict limitation on foreign participation in local airlines. And this is all being reviewed, and we expect this it could be changed in the near future, particularly considering the new president that was just elected two weeks ago. Mm-hmm. So the new president, Jair Bolsonaro, which some people call Donald Trump of Latin America, I'm not sure if I agree with that. It's more liberal. It's inviting a lot of people from the private sector to join the government. It wishes to implement an extensive reform in the political system in Brazil. This could impact the foreign exchange rate. So when he was elected, we saw a valuation of the real, which is now not quite stable. But he has indicated that wishes to work towards having more foreign investment in Brazil. We could expect some tax reforms, not that we should expect an increase in taxation for aviation. Some of the candidates were suggesting that aircraft in Brazil should also have ownership taxes. So, and Bolsonaro, the president-elect, does not agree with that. He never mentioned more taxation for aviation. But if he implements a full reform of taxation rules in Brazil, it could impact aviation, not exactly as an increase in taxes, but some benefits that are provided by trading companies, which is a particular acquisition structure, could be revisited. It's difficult to expect what would happen on this. And just to add that taxation in Brazil for a new aircraft or used aircraft brought into the country when it is imported can vary from 5% to 40%, depending on the acquisition structure, depending on the activity of the company, depending on the state that the aircraft is imported to.
Okay.
So I will please speak about the Brazilian court system, speed of education. Okay, so just to add, we can talk about this in detail later, but it's that in Brazil, Cape Town Convention does not allow for self-help. There is no self-help in Brazil. So if you need to repossess an aircraft, you would need to go to courts anyway to seek for an injunction that normally has been granted on a very fast basis, not because of Cape Town, but because of the understanding of this injunction process. We have seen lessors repossessing aircraft where there was a clear event of default within 10 business days from the day that the claim was filed. So thank you. We can continue with the panel. Now give the word to Fabrice.
Thank you, Felipe. Good morning, everyone. So I work for Jetcraft, so I'm going to speak more about the brokerage side, buying and selling aircraft. I was based in Mexico for the last 3 years, Mexico City. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the updates in Mexico. And it's a little bit of reflection of the last slide of Felipe. So they have a new president that is coming. He's going to start his new role beginning of December of this year. He got elected in July. He's less liberal. He's a social, and I've put social/communist because he's very left-wing. And he's focusing on tackling poverty and corruption in the country. That was the way he got elected in Mexico. And don't get me wrong, that's fantastic, tackling poverty and corruption. You need this in Mexico. But that's not exactly the message that the companies are willing to hear. And he was not the favorite candidate of the business people in Mexico. So there's a possible impact of foreign exchange. As David mentioned, we've seen the pesos to devaluate against the dollars 9% in the last 90 days. So we're going to see once he takes his first reforms and then how it goes. There's probably more taxes and regulations for corporations, which is also not very favorable to private aviation. There's one thing to note is that he's pretty aggressive and pretty hostile with the aviation and private aviation in particular. If you Google him, you will see some videos where he's mentioning that, well, first he just canceled the main airport of Mexico, the new airport of Mexico, which was a $13 billion US project in Mexico. If you go to Mexico City, you will see that the airport is not very modern. And I think it was a very good move for the Mexican to have a new international airport. So many companies that would have been involved in the tender for this airport are, feeling really concerned. And that was like 2 weeks ago, and we've already seen some clients, considering, buying or reselling an aircraft. So it has already had an impact through one of his announcements, even though he's not president yet. He's willing to sell the president aircraft, so that's the video you can find on internet. He's criticizing the Dreamliner of the former president. Saying that it's way too much luxurious and for a person, and he wants to fly commercial. So that's Mr. López Obrador. And he's also willing to sell most of the government VIP fleet, so we see it as an opportunity, but it's not also he's not very keen on private aviation. And I don't want to be too negative, but I mean, we're going to see what happens in the next months. I truly believe that the Mexican fleet is the second private aviation fleet in Latin America. It's a country with very strong corporations. It's a very resilient country, as David mentioned. So I truly believe that the companies in Mexico will be able to balance this government. But we're going to see in the next months how it goes for Mexico. So we need to be a little bit cautious for the next months. Then I'm going to discuss a little bit about the LATAM countries. I'm not going to do the 12 Latin American countries because it's going to be too long. But I just wanted to highlight again that Mexico, Brazil, Venezuela, and Argentina, the four combined, they represent 92% of the jets in Latin America. So from an investor point of view, these are the four countries where you should really focus on because that's the majority of the fleet. Venezuela, I think you've heard all the news about Venezuela, Maduro, the government. It's a total drama. Historically, it was the third market in Latin America with more than 350 aircraft. Currently, it's typically a selling market. The fleet is aging. If you see a buyer from Venezuela, there's a potential that is closed from the government, so it's a bit complicated. And we have the sanctions with the US. So the currency is very, very weak. It's a very complicated situation in Venezuela. Argentina, there's a potential. I mean, they love private aviation, but there's been a major issue in 2018. I don't know if you heard, like the debt of Argentina is significant, and the pesos, the Argentinian pesos, has been very impacted. So it has 94% against the US dollar in 2018. So with $1, you would have had like 18 pesos. Right now, at the end of the year, you get 36 pesos. So it's perfect if you want to go on holidays, but if you want to buy a private jet, it's going to cost you twice, and if you want to operate it, it's going to cost you twice. So it's challenging also in Argentina. Colombia, so there's an appetite for medium, small aircraft. It's a growing market. There's 47 jets in 2018, and it represents 2% of the Latin American jet fleet. And then Chile, also there's a potential. The country is far. That's one of the most stable political and, I mean, economically, it's a very stable country. But it's also a pretty small market compared to the big ones, to Mexico, Brazil. So going back, I would share the optimism for Brazil. Looking at the region in general, I think the focus for this year would be Brazil. We need to see what happens in Mexico, but like for now, it's Brazil.
Thank you, Fabrice. And now, Eduardo, First Source has really carved out a really nice niche in Latin America. You guys have done really well there. If you could talk to us a little bit about why that is, what do you see as bright spots and some of the challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. Good morning, everyone. Got to really shine the light on the Brazilian agricultural sector. We've had stable commodity prices in the US and the decreasing expenses in reals. That sector has really withstood the crisis and has been very prosperous. They're buying aircraft. Brazil in general is very optimistic right now. This year, as we experience, Mexico has had more activity. However, the optimism is much greater in the Brazilian side. They expect greater economic stability with the new president-elect. And the show at La Base this year was one of the best in the past several years. That's the reports that everybody has given out. And there's tremendous opportunity in the country. If you look at the way it breaks down, Brazil has about 5,000 communities, and air taxi operators and airlines only serve about 300. So there's a tremendous opportunity for business aviation there. If you look at the airport systems, 8 airports control basically around 60% of all commercial travel. There's a huge opportunity there. Should lenders look south? In addressing that question on behalf of First Source, I would definitely say no. Nobody else should look south, right? But in all seriously, I mean, I think Joe DiLato had a great observation yesterday saying, you know, we don't try to be everything to everyone. I say not only lenders, but the whole aviation industry should keep Latin America in their radar, because during the dark days of the global economic crisis, many in this room have benefited and were able to sustain some business activity because of Latin America. OEMs reported at NBAA and La Base, you know, over 200 Gulfstreams are in Latin America. 70% of the family of the G650 and 550 are in Latin America. 50% of those 70 are either in Brazil, Mexico, or Venezuela. You know, if you look at the Falcon 8X aircraft, 4 of the first 15 went to Brazil. You know, this year we had the debut of the Gulfstream 600 and the Citation Longitude in Brazil for the first time. You know, we had the first Honda jet delivered earlier in Brazil and has flown over 100 hours already. So unless you are having too much business and you want to pass on opportunities, I say everybody should seriously consider this market, because I think resilience is a great word that has been used. These people and these clients have gone through much more difficult times. You know, they've been there where inflation was 30% a month, and they've survived those much more critical moments. And aviation is just maturing now. There's a lot that needs to be improved in infrastructure and other areas, but as a seller, as a buyer, as a lender, it's a market that should be certainly considered.
Thank you. We had a question here earlier that where's the next upswing? When is the next upswing going to happen in Brazil? One of you guys want to tackle that here? Maybe talking about what the effect of the presidential election?
I'll share a small story, an example from a client. I mean, I had a client very involved and engaged on the campaigning for the candidate that won. And interesting enough, you know, as soon as the elections were over, he already announced that he's opening new stores. And this is a client that has 15,000 employees, and he's already announced that he's going to buy a larger aircraft. Maybe he's putting his money where his mouth was, but again, we already see, and this is contagious. This is from somebody who is on the media and is engaging with a lot of business aviation.
Is he buying a new aircraft?
A larger aircraft, yes.
New or used?
New.
Okay.
And from Jetcraft, I mean, we have a pretty large inventory, so we're getting also more and more requests since the president was elected. So we're seeing more activity and more people asking about our inventory and interested in purchasing. So yeah, hopefully it's going to be in the next months, the upswing.
Anybody have any questions from the audience for the microphones? Just raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone.
Let me just respond to this about the aircraft seizures in Brazil in 2012. That impacted, I would say, hardly the business. A lot of financing structures that would be done in the past, they are not done anymore. So from the presentation that we had yesterday about the issues of VAT and temporary admission and importation in Europe, this is actually the same complexity in Brazil. So clients would import, get an aircraft, a foreign registered aircraft, and fly in and back of Brazil until tax authorities said, well, you're a Brazilian, you should be importing your aircraft on a full importation, and you did this foreign registration to just to avoid taxation. So after that Caesar action, we see the clients just going, what's the safest structure? And the answer normally it is, do a full importation, collect and pay all the taxes. They would use a trading company which allows for a reduction of approximately 15% on the total tax assessed on the importation of the aircraft. Registrations, it's just that we saw aircraft that would be registered abroad and operated for a Brazilian client that became Brazilian register. And on the importation practice, we just saw an increase of the number of full importation aircraft transactions. It also worth mentioning that the temporary admission for private aviation in Brazil was subject to a reform. The rules were changed in 2013 following the seizure action, and now this temporary admission is only available for air taxi or airlines. So a individual or a corporation who wishes to operate a Gulfstream or another private aircraft would need to fully import it. It could not benefit from the temporary admission. So this was also an impact following the seizures. I think only two clients, two parties really lost the aircraft on those on those actions. The majority of them were able to evidence in courts that there was an economic reason, there was a rationale for the aircraft to be registered abroad, whether operations, international operation for some corporations, and also a 60, if the evidence that the aircraft remain at least 60% of the total time outside of Brazil, they were able to recover the aircraft, pay a fine, but not much more issues.
Okay, let's do a rapid fire here. One or two words to describe the Latin American private aviation market today and in the next 3 to 5 years. Eduardo, go.
I'll point it out that problems equal opportunities. I've noticed that 90% of the audience have done business in Latin America, and some have mentioned, never again, or a lot of problems, and I understand that. However, every time you face a problem, that means there's an opportunity there, especially if you're dealing with experts, and if you surround yourself with the knowledge necessary to close those deals, you could reap tremendous benefits.
Fabrice?
Yeah, I would agree. Like the complexity, would generate also opportunities. The ability to do deals in Latin America, it's not for any type of companies, and I think it's, again, an exciting market. I've shown some part that were not very exciting, but we're pretty much optimistic.
So complexity, but with opportunities, but with some complexity. Okay, all right. Felipe?
I would say opportunities and a lot of innovation. Aviation in Latin America, particularly Brazil, needs to expand. We do have hopes that there's going to be new regulations for regional aviation, investments in airport infrastructure, and with the upsizing of the economy that we hope to happen in the next months following the election, to see new aircraft coming in, a fleet renewal, of course, all helped by this by Cape Town Convention, by new acquisition structures, but a lot of I just see opportunity in Brazil and in other countries in Latin America for business aviation. It's not well explored. Just need to have more investment. Brazil does not allow fractional ownership as allowed in the U.S., but this is probably going to be reformed also with the new aeronautical code and the new rules. We have seen companies targeting Brazil for seat sharing, for selling of empty legs, but the regulations are very strict. So I would say that opportunities, but that need to overcome a lot of hurdles from regulatory issues and the legal framework.
Okay. We have a question here. Are Brazilians patriotic about Embraer?
Yes, of course.
I think Embraer has done Embraer is frankly one of the things that Brazilians are most patriotic about.
Would it be Petrobras, Embraer, and soccer, I would say.
It's an interesting world we live in, though, globally speaking, because in the auto industry you have American companies producing in Mexico, right, manufacturing in Mexico. Mm. Then you have Japanese companies manufacturing in the U.S. We just have a new leader, Michael Maftano, as an American leading. It's hard to tell. What is a Brazilian company? What is an American company? Now it's a much more global economy. So I would say Brazilians are very proud of the company, but they do realize that this is becoming a global environment in general, and we are all connected.
Yeah. What are trends in the charter market in Latin America? Size, growth, routes, operators? Any comments on that?
Just to add these new regulations in Brazil about seat sharing, flight sharing, that could allow a growth in the charter market in Brazil. The routes we see new ventures on regional aviation. So companies who are acquiring smaller aircraft just to provide short distance flights. And there's an operator that has just entered in a cooperation agreement with Go Airlines to provide more capillarity for the routes operated by Go. So there's also, I see opportunities in Brazil for the charter market, which is not explored also. The fleet for the available aircraft for chartered in Brazil, it's a very small fleet. It's often that if an individual needs a large cabin jet for a certain route, that would need to charter from outside of Brazil, since there's maybe 2 or 3 135 operators that would have a full fleet comprising mid-size and large-size jets.
What other questions do we have there?
There's a question on the tactics. I guess tactics for Latin America. Get that question? How was it? Do marketing tactics differ in LATAM? And I think they look consider differently than what we do in North America. Well, I think it's in the name of the region. It's Latin, so it's a different way of doing business. So in terms of marketing, you can do whatever you want in terms of marketing and online and offline and do stuff. The human relationship is extremely important. So if you don't take the time to spend time with your customers in Latin America, the outcome that you might get will be different. I'm going to take an example in Mexico. In Mexico, they go for lunch at like 3 p.m. and most of the time they end up around like 7 or 8. That sounds crazy, but that's the way it is. And the way they do business is around this lunch. There's a lot of business that is done. So it's a cultural. It's different than in the U.S. In the U.S., you would shake hand, agree on a price, and go and walk away. In Mexico, it's going to be a very long process, and it's a bit the same in all Latin America. So. Despite any marketing tactic, I think the human relationship you build in Latin America are key. That would be the...
So a very relationship-based approach?
Yeah.
Okay.
Individual and based, yeah.
Okay. To what level do local banks have appetite for BizJet financing leasing deals?
I think local banks are always after the relationship. Often, especially when you compare it to U.S. lenders, the cross-selling is huge for them. They often have the relationship on the receivable sides, on the lines of credit, so the wealth management, that client is much more valuable to the local banks because of all the products they can offer. And often, still cash is our biggest competitor, because a lot of these clients are paying at least half of the time cash for their aircraft.
And we saw an increase of the appetite of local banks in Brazil, particularly for financing and leasing deals after those seizure actions and other actions by tax authorities in Brazil that were targeting offshore financing structures. So over the last 5 years, we have seen a considerable increase in the number of transactions with local banks.
Any other questions from the audience before we wrap up here? So Al, I'd like to make a request here based upon the law-based schedule, maybe starting CJI at noon from now on. That would be wonderful.
Okay, well, your feedback is very valuable to us. If you can fill in the form on the desk.
Put that in the suggestion box.
Yeah, you can fill in.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.